Gandalf was more than he seemed. The old man in grey robes, with his tattered hat and weathered staff, was not just a wise wanderer or a master of fireworks. He was not merely a wizard, though that was the name most knew him by. He was something far older, something far greater, an immortal being who had seen the birth of the world itself. And yet, those who walked beside him, those who fought and bled alongside him in the Fellowship of the Ring, never truly understood what he was. To them, he was a guide, a mentor, a protector. He was the mind behind their mission, the force that held them together. But did they ever suspect the truth? Did they know that Gandalf was not simply a wise old man, but a Maia, an angelic spirit, bound in flesh, sent from beyond the world to wage war against Sauron? Did they know he could not truly die, that he had existed before the sun and moon? And if they didn't, why? Why did Gandalf keep his true nature hidden, even from those who trusted him most? It was not by accident. Gandalf and the other wizards, the Istari, arrived in Middle-earth not as conquerors or rulers, but as guides. They had power beyond the reckoning of mortals, but they were forbidden from using it to dominate or command. They were messengers, sent to nudge the free peoples toward their own salvation. The Valar, the great godlike beings who ruled over the world from the undying lands, had learned from past mistakes. They had once fought Sauron's master Morgoth in open war, and though they had won, Middle-earth had been shattered in the process. This time, they would not wage war themselves. This time they would send envoys, subtle forces of wisdom rather than might. And so, Gandalf arrived, not as a blazing spirit of divine power, but as an old man, robed in grey, weathered by the road. He was not to lead armies, but to inspire others to take up the fight. The same was true of the others of his order, Saruman the White, Radagast the Brown, and the two blue wizards who vanished into the east. All of them, save one, would ultimately stray from their mission. Only Gandalf would truly remain faithful to his purpose. But the cost of that faithfulness was secrecy. He could not reveal what he was, not fully. He could not allow others to rely on him as a god or a king. If Middle-earth was to be saved, it would not be because of him. It would be because its people chose to stand and fight for themselves. And so, when the Fellowship formed, Gandalf let them see only what they needed to see. To the Hobbits, he was the wandering wizard who had visited the Shire for decades, the one who had brought fireworks to Bilbo's birthday, the one who whispered of far-off lands and ancient dangers. They knew he was wise. They knew he was powerful. But they never questioned what he truly was. It had never occurred to them that he might be something other than what he appeared. Boromir, the warrior of Gondor, saw a different side of Gandalf. To him, the wizard was a force of mystery, a figure spoken of in the great halls of Minas Tirith, whispered of in old tales. He knew that Gandalf had counseled his father, Denethor, though that counsel had been unwelcome. He knew that the wizard wielded knowledge and power beyond any man. But to Boromir, Gandalf was still mortal. He could be questioned. He could be opposed. He could, perhaps, be wrong. Gimli, son of Glóin, had his own view. His father had traveled with Gandalf years before, on the journey to reclaim Erebor. Gimli had grown up hearing of the wizard's wisdom, his cunning, and his role in the fall of Smaug. He respected Gandalf, as all dwarves respected those who proved themselves. But dwarves were not prone to dwelling on things beyond their own world. They had little interest in the affairs of the Valar, and the nature of the Maia was not something they concerned themselves with. To Gimli, Gandalf was simply a wizard, as wizards had always been. Legolas, however, had reason to suspect more. As an elf, he had lived for centuries, perhaps even millennia. He had heard of Gandalf before, long before the events of the War of the Ring. The elves of Middle-earth, particularly the oldest and wisest among them, had long known that Gandalf was more than he appeared. The Lady Galadriel knew the truth, as did Elrond and Círdan the shipwright. These were elves who had seen the Undying Lands, who understood the nature of the Valar and the Maia. And Aragorn? He knew more than most. Raised in Rivendell under Elrond's care, he had grown up hearing of Gandalf's wisdom. He had walked beside him for years, fighting in the shadows against the forces of Sauron, long before Frodo ever set out with the ring. If anyone in the Fellowship was closest to understanding the truth, it was Aragorn. But even he did not know for certain. He, like Legolas, might have suspected, but suspicion is not knowledge. For the most part, the members of the Fellowship accepted Gandalf as he appeared to them. He was wise, he was powerful, he was a leader, but he was still, at least in their minds, a man, albeit one of extraordinary skill and knowledge. When he fell in Moria, when the Balrog dragged him into the abyss, they mourned him as they would any great hero. They believed he was gone, and that was the proof. If they had known the truth, they would have waited for him. If they had understood what he was, they would have expected his return. But they did not, because even in death, Gandalf kept his secret. Gandalf's power had always been evident, but for much of the journey, he kept it restrained. He lit fires with a word when no other flame would catch. He sensed the movement of the enemy when no one else could. He understood the deep magic of the world in a way that no mortal could ever grasp. But all of this could still be explained, at least in the minds of those around him. He was a wizard, after all. Wizards were mysterious, powerful figures, and Gandalf, though remarkable, was still bound by the rules that men and elves understood. And then came Moria. The ancient dwarven city was a place of legend, even among the Fellowship. It had been abandoned for centuries, swallowed by shadow and silence. Gimli believed it could still be reclaimed, that his kinsmen might have returned to its halls. But when the Fellowship entered, they found only death. The orcs had swarmed through its tunnels, and something worse lurked in the depths. Something older than the kingdoms of men, older than the rings of power, older even than Sauron himself. A Balrog. When the drums began to sound in the deep, the Fellowship ran. They fought their way through the black halls, past swarms of orcs, past nameless things lurking in the dark. And then, as they reached the bridge of Khazad-dûm, the true enemy emerged. The Balrog of Morgoth, wreathed in flame, a creature of pure destruction. This was no mere beast. This was no orc or troll. This was something ancient, something terrible, a Maia, just as Gandalf was. But unlike Gandalf, the Balrog had chosen a path of ruin, a servant of the first Dark Lord, Morgoth, who had once sought to unmake the world itself. And for the first time, the Fellowship saw Gandalf as he truly was. They did not see a feeble old man, nor a wise but frail guide. They saw power, true power. He did not hesitate. He turned and faced the demon alone. There was no fear in his voice, only command. You cannot pass. The battle was beyond anything the Fellowship had seen before. Gandalf did not simply fight. He unleashed something deeper, something they had never witnessed. The clash between him and the Balrog was not like the battles of men or elves. It was something more, something primal. It was a war between two beings who had existed since before the world was shaped, two creatures made of the same immortal fire. But none of them understood that. Not yet. Then, as the bridge shattered beneath them, the Balrog fell. But in its final moment, it lashed out. A whip of fire coiled around Gandalf's ankle, and in an instant, he too was pulled into the abyss. The Fellowship could only watch in horror as he disappeared into the darkness. For them, this was death. There was no question. Gandalf was gone. He had been their leader, their guide, their protector, and now he was lost. They did not consider the possibility that he might return. Why would they? They did not know the truth of what he was. To them, he had fallen just as any man would. And so they mourned. They pressed on without him, grief weighing on them like a heavy chain. They never once questioned whether he might come back. They never imagined that he was not truly gone. They had no way of knowing that Gandalf's battle was far from over. Far below the surface of the world, in the black depths where no light had ever shone, the battle continued. Gandalf and the Balrog fell, locked in combat. They crashed into the hidden lake at the base of Moria's roots, and there the fight raged on. For days they clashed, from the blackest chasms to the frozen peaks above the world. Time had no meaning in that struggle, only fire, only fury. And then finally Gandalf prevailed. But victory had a price. His body, the fragile human shell that he had worn for so long, could bear the strain no longer. It burned away, broken by the forces he had unleashed. And yet, he did not die. Not as mortals understand death. He was pulled from time itself, drawn beyond the world, beyond the veil that separates life from eternity. He had fulfilled his task as Gandalf the Grey, but his mission was not over. He was sent back, restored, remade. When he opened his eyes, he was not as he had been. He was more. He was Gandalf the White. But the Fellowship did not know this yet. They had traveled far, struggling without him. They had entered Lothlorien. They had mourned his loss, and they had continued on their journey. And then, as they made their way through the wild lands beyond Rohan, they encountered something unexpected. A figure in white. At first, they did not recognize him. Legolas, sharp-eyed and wise, was the first to react. He mistook the figure for Saruman, for who else could it be? No other being they knew had such radiance, such power. The moment was charged with fear and uncertainty. And then, recognition. Gandalf stood before them, alive and yet not the same. His robes were no longer grey and worn. They shone white, brighter than the sun upon the snow. His presence was different, almost too much to bear. He was the same, and yet he was not. He had changed. And that change made them question, how was this possible? What had happened? How had he returned? But Gandalf did not explain. He spoke of battles beyond their understanding, of fire and shadow, of being sent back. But he did not say how. He did not tell them the full truth of what he was, because he never had. Even now, even as he returned from the edge of existence itself, he did not reveal his true nature. He let them wonder. He let them believe what they wished to believe, because in the end, it did not matter. They did not need to know that he was a Maia, an immortal spirit sent by the Valar. They did not need to understand that he had walked the world long before the rise of men. They did not need to grasp the full extent of his power. They only needed to know that he had returned, because the battle was not yet over. Among all the peoples of Middle-earth, only a select few truly knew the nature of Gandalf. He had walked their lands for thousands of years, but his identity had always been cloaked in mystery. He was known by many names: Mithrandir among the elves, Tharkun among the dwarves, and to men, simply Gandalf. But his real name, the one that few ever learned, was Olorin, a Maia spirit from beyond the circles of the world. There were whispers. The elves, the oldest of Middle-earth's inhabitants, had their suspicions. Elrond, Lord of Rivendell, had known Gandalf for centuries. He had seen wisdom and power beyond what any mere man should possess. But Elrond himself was no ordinary elf. He had lived in Valinor, had stood in the presence of the Valar themselves. He understood that beings like Gandalf were not of Middle-earth. but were sent by powers greater than any kingdom of men or elves. Then there was Galadriel, the Lady of Lothlorien, perhaps the wisest of the Eldar still remaining in Middle-earth. She knew more than most. She had seen Gandalf arrive, had sensed the power that lay hidden beneath the humble grey robes. It was she who gifted him Narya, the Ring of Fire, one of the 3 great elven rings. She would not have entrusted such a treasure to a mere wanderer or scholar. She knew he was something else entirely. And then there was Círdan the Shipwright. Of all the elves, he alone knew the truth from the very beginning. When Gandalf first stepped foot in Middle-earth, disguised as an old man, it was Círdan who looked past the form and saw the spirit beneath. Without hesitation, he gave Gandalf Narya and spoke words of prophecy, telling him that his task would be long and that his burdens would be heavy. But beyond these few, there was almost no one who understood. And in the Fellowship, there was no reason for any of them to question who or what Gandalf truly was. Aragorn had spent much of his life in Gandalf's company, learning from him, fighting beside him. He understood that Gandalf was unlike any man he had ever known, that he possessed knowledge and power that stretched beyond human limitations. But Aragorn had been raised in Rivendell. He knew the old stories, the myths of the Valar and Maia, of beings older than the world itself. And perhaps deep down, he suspected, Legolas had an even better reason to wonder. He was the son of Thranduil, king of the woodland realm, and though he was young by elven standards, he had seen many things. His people had encountered Gandalf before, and their knowledge of ancient beings was greater than that of men or dwarves. But even so, there is no evidence that Legolas ever realized Gandalf's true nature. He respected him, he followed him, but he did not question what he was. Gimli, like all dwarves, was concerned with the here and now. The affairs of spirits and gods mattered little to his kind. Dwarves believed in what they could see, touch, and build with their own hands. To Gimli, Gandalf was simply a wise and powerful wizard. There was no need to think beyond that. And then there were the Hobbits. For all their bravery, for all their heart and unexpected resilience, the Hobbits were utterly oblivious to Gandalf's deeper identity. They saw him as a great figure, wise and strong, but they had no frame of reference for anything beyond that. The Hobbits had lived in peace for so long that their world had shrunk to the size of their fields and villages. If they ever thought about Gandalf's origins, they likely imagined he was simply an unusually old and learned man. The idea that he was an immortal spirit sent by divine powers to shape the fate of the world would have been beyond their comprehension. But that was exactly how Gandalf wanted it. He did not tell them because it did not matter. The moment the Fellowship started looking to him as something more than a guide, they would stop believing in their own ability to shape their own destiny. If they saw him as an immortal being, they might have expected him to do everything, to lead the fight against Sauron directly. And that was the very thing he could not do. His task was not to lead, not to rule, not to command. His task was to inspire. This was the great difference between Gandalf and Sauron. Both were Maiar. Both had immense power. But while Sauron sought dominion, Gandalf sought to give others the strength to act. Where Sauron used fear and deception, Gandalf used wisdom and encouragement. He could not wield his full might to destroy the Dark Lord, because that was not the way the Valar wished this war to be fought. If Middle-earth was to be saved, its people had to save themselves. And so, he let them believe what they wished. He let them see only what they needed to see. When he fell in Moria, the Fellowship mourned him as they would any mortal. Had they known the truth, they might have waited for him. But they did not. They did not understand that he had faced something greater than death itself, that he had battled through the void and returned, reforged into something even greater. When he reappeared, when he stood before them as Gandalf the White, they knew that something had changed. He was stronger, more radiant, more powerful than before. But still, he did not explain. He spoke only of his return, of the task still before them. He let them wonder. He let them believe in the mystery. Because what mattered was not where he came from, or what he truly was. What mattered was the fight ahead. What mattered was the mission. And that was all they needed to know. Gandalf's true nature, whether known or unknown, had a profound impact on the fate of Middle-earth. If the Fellowship had understood what he really was, if they had grasped the full extent of his power, his origins, his immortality, would things have played out the same way? Would they have fought as hard? Would they have relied on their own strength, or would they have placed their trust entirely in him? This was the danger that Gandalf himself had always understood. Power can inspire, but it can also create dependence. If the Fellowship had known he was a Maia, they might have waited for him to solve their problems instead of facing their trials on their own. But Gandalf was never meant to be a savior in the way people expected. He was not sent to Middle-earth to slay Sauron or to wield armies like a king. He was sent to guide, to nurture, to light a fire in the hearts of others so that they would stand against the darkness themselves. This was why he never revealed the full truth. Not to Frodo, who bore the ring and needed to believe that this was his burden to carry. Not to Aragorn, who had to rise to his own destiny without the weight of knowing he fought alongside an immortal. Not to Boromir, who might have seen Gandalf's power as something to be used for Gondor's gain. Even after his return as Gandalf the White, he did not break this silence. He could have told them everything. He could have revealed that he was Olorin, a being older than the world itself, who had walked among the gods before the first star was lit. But he did not, because that knowledge would not have helped them. It would have only made them question their own role in the fight. And so, even after he returned from death itself, he let them believe only what they could understand. He spoke of battles they could not comprehend, of forces beyond the world, but never of his own nature. He let them think of him as Gandalf the Wizard, no more, no less. It was the same with the world at large. The people of Middle-earth, from the men of Rohan to the people of Gondor, saw him as a mighty figure, wise and powerful, but ultimately human in form and limits. They knew he was ancient, that he had walked among kings and counseled lords for generations, but even the wisest of them did not realize what that meant. They did not stop to wonder how old he truly was, or why time never seemed to touch him. Denethor, steward of Gondor, had once sought counsel from Gandalf, but had come to resent him, fearing his influence over his son, Faramir. He believed Gandalf to be a mere meddler, an old man playing at power. If he had known the truth, if he had understood that Gandalf had seen the rise and fall of empires beyond counting, would he still have dismissed him so easily? Or would he have feared him even more? Gondor was a land steeped in history, a kingdom that had endured for thousands of years. Its rulers revered the past, clung to the wisdom of ages gone by. And yet, even they failed to see what Gandalf truly was. They saw only a wizard, an enigma, a figure of power who never claimed a throne or sought to rule. The truth was hidden, but it was not buried. There were signs, clues, hints scattered throughout his actions, his words, his very presence. But no one put the pieces together, not until the war was won, and Gandalf was gone. Because in the end, it did not matter who he was. It did not matter that he was a Maia, an immortal spirit who had walked the halls of the Valar. It did not matter that he had fought in the great wars before Middle-earth was even born. It did not matter that he had stood against Sauron's master, Morgoth, in the days of old. What mattered was what he did. What mattered was that he guided the free peoples to victory, not by wielding his full power, but by ensuring that others rose to the occasion. Frodo carried the ring, not because Gandalf could not, but because it had to be Frodo's burden. Aragorn reclaimed his throne, not because Gandalf commanded him to, but because he found the strength within himself. Rohan rode to war, Gondor stood against the darkness, the peoples of Middle-earth rallied, not because they were led by a god, but because they believed in themselves. That was why Gandalf never revealed the truth. Because Middle-earth did not need a savior, it needed heroes. And that, in the end, is what made the difference.